On the Senate floor Wednesday, Senator Roger Marshall pitched a bill that would formally designate major Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations under federal law. Marshall, who attacked President Biden and alleged an open border agenda, said the new designation would give the government greater powers to address the crisis of fentanyl deaths. The motion was blocked by Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, who decried the massive rise of fentanyl fatalities. Menendez argued that the bill was too new and had not been committee tested despite its, quote, sweeping and mandatory nature. The New Jersey senator's blocking led to further debate between the two senators.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kansas.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Menendez and I be permitted to complete our remarks prior to the scheduled recess.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise in support of our legislation to formally designate the major Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations under federal law. It would also require the State Department to issue a report to Congress on additional cartels that meet the criteria for foreign terrorist organizations designation and require the department to designate them as such within 30 days of the report. This bill will give us greater tools to push back against the cartels fueling the White House's deadly open border crisis. This past March, I was honored and proud to lead 5 Kansas sheriffs to the border, to meet with Border Patrol officers and survey the ongoing immigration crisis at our border. With our own eyes, we saw the activities of the major Mexican drug cartels that qualify them for designation as a foreign terrorist organization, as they are transnational entities that engage in textbook terrorist activity such as kidnapping, assassination, and endangering lives with explosives and firearms. Additionally, these cartels are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, especially young Americans in their prime. Fentanyl has quickly become the leading cause of death among adults ages 18 to 45. Last year, the number of drug overdose deaths in the United States topped 100,000, with fentanyl being the cause of more than 2/3 of them. The vast majority of fentanyl precursors, as we all know now, are manufactured in China and then chemically turned into lethal fentanyl by the cartels. Next, the cartels smuggle the poison into the United States via the southwest border. In fact, the DEA reports that an astounding 80% of the fentanyl in America comes into our country through the United States-Mexico open border. Last week, we introduced the Cooper-Davis Act, a bill named after Cooper Davis, a Johnson County, Kansas teen who tragically lost his life to fentanyl poisoning last summer after just taking 1/2 of one pill of fake Percocet that contained, unfortunately, a lethal dose of fentanyl. Sadly, Cooper Davis is not the only victim in Kansas from the actions of the Mexican cartels, as most every day we lose a young person in Kansas due to the actions of these terrorist cartel operations. And I know every single one of my Senate colleagues have victims from their states who have been poisoned and murdered from this same illicit fentanyl. That's right, Americans are dead. Hundreds being murdered every day because of this administration's open border policies and zero respect for border security. Last year, the Border Patrol seized at the southern border 11,000 pounds of fentanyl. That's over 5 tons of this poison. They seized over 5,000 pounds of heroin, nearly a ton of meth, and almost 1,000 pounds of cocaine, and finally 10,000 pounds of ketamine. Of course, this is a fraction of how much of this poison actually crossed the border and was transported into our communities undetected, making every state a border state. Regardless, this represents many, many multiples of the amounts needed to kill every man, woman, and child in the United States. Indeed, this sounds like a weapon of mass destruction. Joe Biden's open border policies are responsible for the deaths of thousands of young American men, women, and children. To anyone who knows the brutal tactics and extensive operations that cartels use on both sides of our southern border every single day, there is no question that they should be described, designated, and treated as terrorists. These people who hang, behead, and burn people alive to threaten and control government officials in Mexico, and now with cartel members in most likely every state of the union, yes, even in Kansas, they actively engage in these same dangerous, murderous tactics here domestically. For more than 10 years, Texas Republicans have been trying to label Mexican cartels terrorists in an effort to try and cripple their empires. This week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott made a declaration establishing a Mexican cartel division within the Texas Fusion Center at the Texas Department of Public Safety, which his office said will conduct multi-jurisdictional investigations with local law enforcement in other states. The unsustainable crisis at the border has impacted not only Americans, but the migrants themselves, who have often traveled hundreds of miles on foot and can be exploited by these terrorist organizations. Just yesterday, the Washington Examiner reported those being brought across the border by coyotes are paying an average of $8,600 in total smuggling fees this year, mimicking what mafias do, who charge a fee, literally a tax, to enter their territory and pass through. The Biden open border surge has enriched these terrorist organizations, and we must step up our defenses against them as they continue to wreak havoc on communities all across the country. And it cannot go on any longer. Listen, designating Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations will give our federal government new ways to fight back. That is, if the White House will allow them to. A foreign terrorist organization designation provides additional tools for law enforcement and national security authorities to take action, including by providing additional investigation and intelligence resources and sanction capabilities. For example, a foreign terrorist organization designation would, number one, make it unlawful for any person who knowingly provides material support or resources to the cartel to enter the United States. Next, it prevents any member of a designated cartel from legally entering the United States. And finally, it would allow the Secretary of the Treasury to block all assets possessed or controlled by the cartels. The cartels are playing a massive role in the ongoing crisis at the border. By exploiting Joe Biden's open border policies, the cartels have increased their power and wealth at the expense of innocent lives that get in their way. I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation to formally designate the major Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations under federal law and help stem the tide of dangerous drugs and other illicit goods pouring across our open southern border. Surely this is an effort we can all get behind, as every senator in this body affirmed by oath that they would support and defend the Constitution upon their swearing in. This importantly includes providing for the common defense of our people. Personally, I will not rest until we stop this war on the youth of young Americans. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 4914 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion be be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, and I appreciate my friend, I do consider him my friend and colleague, in his concern, which we mutually share on this issue. But this legislation was introduced 7 days ago. 7 days ago. Most of our colleagues have not even had a chance to read it. The Foreign Relations Committee, which I have the privilege of chairing, has not reviewed or marked up this bill since it just got referred to us. And to my knowledge, my colleague has not made any effort to engage the committee. Especially in light of its sweeping and mandatory nature and the lack of any waiver, even if a waiver were in our national interests, members with expertise in foreign affairs need to have the opportunity to scrutinize the bill. Regular order allows us to refine legislation. It ensures we avoid unintended consequences, and that's needed here. Now, Mr. President, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I take the threat of Mexican drug trafficking organizations seriously. During my 30 years in Congress, I have made significant efforts to combat drug trafficking in Mexico, Latin America, the Caribbean, and around the world. Given the potential impact of this legislation, I would just ask my colleague the following questions for his consideration. This is what questions I ask myself as I'm looking at his request. The United States Congress has developed a framework of sanctions specifically to target drug traffickers. It's called the Kingpin Act. There is substantial overlap between the Kingpin Act and what is being proposed today. Is this redundancy helpful or is it hurtful? Why is it needed? S 4914 provides no new funding for the management of our sanctions program targeting foreign terrorist organizations, and we are deeply engaged in our whole sanctions operation as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. This would be additional, but it has no additional resources. Do we want to stretch the U.S. government's personnel and resources that target foreign terrorist organizations? That's what the legislation would do. Does my colleague want to explain to the American people why we should have less personnel and funding dedicated to countering Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda? Because as it is, that's what the legislation would do. Mr. President, the members of the Foreign Relations Committee take the threat posed by Mexican cartels very seriously. We know that the cartels are deeply involved in the production and trafficking of fentanyl. We know that this is a substance so lethal it kills tens of thousands of American citizens every year. That's why in June, the committee approved the Fentanyl Results Act legislation designed to strengthen the United States response to fentanyl trafficking. Legislation that received unanimous, bipartisan backing of all members of the Foreign Relations Committee. Legislation that we hope can be enacted into law before the end of this Congress. That's a serious legislative effort conducted through normal order of the Senate. So I would just say to my friend, if you really want to address the impact that Mexican cartels and drug trafficking have in the American people, I urge you respectfully to work through the Foreign Relations Committee, join us in a meaningful legislative effort. And finally, before I object, I would just say I know that my colleague keeps talking about the Biden open borders. Well, it's a little incongruous when you self-designate and made in your comments that it is the U.S. Customs and Border large catches of fentanyl and other drugs under the direction of this administration that is making those catches. So it's either that we have an open border where anything comes in, or it is that the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol that is actively engaged is stopping the flow of significant amount of drugs. And so for all of those reasons, at this point in time, I will have to object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I certainly do respect the comments of the chairman. I would ask him a question. What would you tell the mother of Cooper Davis? What would you tell the mother of the hundreds of Americans that are going to die today from fentanyl poisoning? Whatever we're doing now, it's not working. This is a war. Just yesterday morning at 1 a.m., we were given 250 pages of legislation that we were asked to vote on that evening. This is a 3 or 4 page bill. I had declared war on fentanyl. Every day in Kansas, someone is dying from fentanyl. Every day in the state of New Jersey, probably several people are dying from fentanyl poisoning. I would ask the chairman, whatever we're doing, it's not working. What more can we do? What do I tell Cooper Davis's mom? What do I tell these people out there whose babies are dying? They're the young adults being taken from the prime of our life. Whatever we've done is not working. This stuff is coming over by the tons. What we've captured is a fraction of what's reaching America. That's why Kansas is no longer safe. It's not safe for any of our young adults. This is why this Halloween we're going to have to put our kids on special watch as this candied fentanyl comes across the border. I don't see how anyone that cares about our youth and young adults could object to this. I yield back.
Senator from New Jersey.
I can't let the question rhetorically hang there. I would say to my colleague, first of all, for all of us who have been fighting this issue on a bipartisan basis, I think his bill has only got Republican sponsors on it, a few, that we have been fighting this, and this is a continuous fight. And yes, every life that is lost is a life that we mourn. But what would I say to them? I would say, well, if we get the Fentanyl Results Act legislation passed, that passed the committee on a bipartisan basis, we would have a bipartisan approach towards dealing with this. I appreciate that my colleague has declared war on fentanyl, but just because he's declared war doesn't mean that his view as to how you meet the challenge is the ultimate result, is the ultimate solution. And so, in good faith, I offer our colleague to work with us, but you can't end up making the Senate the committee of the whole. If we want to do that, good. Let's abolish all of our committees, and let's all sit here, and we can bring up legislation after legislation that was just introduced where nobody has a chance to read it and nobody has a chance to understand the unintended consequences, as noble as the intent might be. But that's what my colleague has done on more than one occasion now. Introduces a piece of legislation and days after comes to the floor to seek its approval. Well, that bypasses the entire system that is meant as a check and balance to get the best legislation to accomplish a common goal. So that's what I would say. We need to work on this together. We're committed to it. That's why we passed legislation in the past. That's why we just passed legislation recently. I hope my colleague will join us. Maybe we can get an NDNA together. And with that, I yield the floor.